Welcome to the Homelab Show, episode 117. Now that our technical difficulties are over, we're live.
I
That's
have a
up.
feeling I'll be dealing with this for a little while until I just get all the bugs worked out, but it's coming along at least.
Yeah, Jay's been setting up his new studio, so things are a little bit slower sometimes. It's so much fine tuning that goes into these building out this. And by the way, we're not studio or production experts. We inadvertently have to learn this to produce this content where we bring to you. And the content today specifically is going to be about the Raspberry Pi 5.
Yep. I just started looking into it. So just I always like to gauge where I'm at in the process because obviously if just starting out with something isn't as good as having used it for a long time, but I have more than enough information to convey some initial thoughts and talk about what's different this time around. And there's some things that I think some people will really want to pay attention to because buying a Raspberry Pi board by itself is just probably not going to work. And I'll explain.
Yeah, there's I don't know. I haven't worn out my fours yet, so I haven't decided on the five. I mean, I love the extra features it gets, but
Oh
I'll
yeah.
actually reference too, and maybe I'll add it to the description. Jeff Geerling did a comparison of the Raspberry Pi 5 that is controversial, if you will,
One
comparing
of
it to
the
the Game
first
100.
points is from his video. I was just about to mention him as well. So
Oh, perfect. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you search Raspberry Pi, you're also probably searching Jeff Geerling, or at least the autocomplete will force you to it for good
yeah,
reason. Jeff does a lot of great in-depth coverage on the Raspberry Pi 5. So,
I think we should. Yeah, we'll just link to his video as well because I think in addition to the things that I mentioned, he'll kind of round the edges and go even
yeah.
deeper because he's been using it for far longer than I have.
Absolutely. We do not have a sponsor at the moment, but we do still have links down there for Linode, our previous sponsor, because there's still some help it gives out to the channel. If you want to click on that, any of the affiliate links you find in the descriptions of the videos on the channel, those are always helpful. So we can actually jump right into the content, which I know people are happy. Like there's,
Yeah. So, all right. So, first of all, I'll have to admit, I wasn't very impressed when I first heard about it. Now, that was my fault. That initial reaction versus having spent some time looking into it, this time was very different because at first, it's quad core. There's a 4 gig version, there's an 8 gig version. It uses an SD card for boot, gigabit Ethernet, USB 3. So far, nothing sounds different. It sounds like the Raspberry Pi 4 again. So, I actually thought that it was just a very small, point release, if you will. I didn't realize until I dug deeper into it that this is anything but. This is actually big, just not, it's more in the lines of like obvious versus not obvious. So let's just start with the very basics and then we'll kind of build in and we'll see what's different this time around. So, first of all, $60 for the 4 gig version, US dollars for those of you that aren't here and are in the same country as us. $80 for the 8 gigabyte version. So it's practically very similar, maybe a little bit more. I don't see a 2 gig version though. So just
yeah, I
throwing that
think
out there.
there's probably a low demand. They got rid of those.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. So again, first of all, it looks about the same, but I watched Jeff Geerling's video and compared what he said to what Raspberry Pi is saying, because Raspberry Pi is saying that this is 2 times faster than the 4. Now, what's interesting though is Jeff Geerling says something different. He says that it's 2.5 times faster than the Pi 4. And Jeff is one of those people where, and if you know Jeff like we do, you'll know what I mean. If he goes against what the vendor saying, I'll go with Jeff Geerling every time. Like he puts so many testing in it. He's the only person that I would rank higher than the vendor in most cases. So if he says it's 2.5 times faster, I'll agree. But we'll get into the specs in a moment. I haven't done any benchmarking at this point, so I just want to throw that out there that I haven't yet had an opportunity to try to disprove him. But every time I ran the same or run the same test he does, I get the same results. So I'm going to have to say it's probably 2.5 times faster. Either way, even if it's just 2 times faster, that already kind of makes it worth looking into. So um, moving along here, let's in no particular order. I have a bunch of notes. So the CPU is the BCM 2712, 16 nanometer. Can't talk today. Process. And I'm just reading some of these notes right off the website just to get us started. 512 kilobyte per core level 2 cache, a shared 2 megabyte cache, It integrates again, I'm just reading, a 12-core video core, 7 GPU. And so there's a lot of new video features added to this. The original, or not original, but the previous one had, I believe it had H254, and I'm not sure about the HEVC. But anyway, this has a number of codecs built in, but I haven't yet tested it for this purpose because I haven't edited on a Raspberry Pi. But I wouldn't think that that would even as good as this one is. I don't think I'll be editing on this one anytime soon. But anyway, they have their own processor, and specifically, it's a 2.4 gigahertz quad core, 64-bit ARM Cortex A76. That's a mouthful. The previous model was 1.8 gigahertz, so we're already, even though both are quad core, the clock speed this time around is going to put it up above the previous one. But there's also, and this is another thing that's different, two 4-lane transceivers built onto the board. Each one can be used for either a display or a camera. Two displays, two cameras, one of each, whatever you want to do, or just ignore it altogether if you're building something else. And this also means that if you have cables for the previous camera, you will need an adapter. So that's the first thing I'll mention about you'll need to buy some things because some of your old accessories may not work this time around. And that's the first one. If you have those old cables, you'll need an adapter for that. So just throwing that out there.
Now, one thing I want to comment on just about
Yep.
the Raspberry Pi ecosystem is one of the things I think it's really drove its success is it's like a standardization platform. You
Right.
have a very predictable device with predictable GPIO pins, predictable types of connectors that has an ecosystem around it. And from a software setup standpoint, they've done a nice job because the Raspberry Pi Imager lets you predictably, again, it's not x86 where we have to find different drivers for things. It's this
Yep.
platform that supports these services so we can easily flash it to be whatever we want. I think that's just a really good selling point of what's made the Raspberry Pi so successful in the market. And well, I'll reference Jeff because he did a write up on this because people say, but what about the banana pie, orange pie, other knockoffs, if you will? I don't know that knockoff is the right term. There are companies that
Yeah.
copied it, but he pointed out right away, sometimes it's harder to find drivers or some of the changes for
Right.
those until their ecosystems get developed. And for people writing software that you want to go, hey, I can tell you to image this to a SD card and it will absolutely boot and predictably work the way you expect it to on this model Raspberry Pi.
Hmm. Absolutely. One thing that hasn't changed is the networking chip. It's a gig network. I was hoping for 2.5. That would have been cool, but that's not what we have here. So if you're looking for faster networking, you'll be let down by this, or maybe not, because you'll have fewer things getting in your way because of all the other things being improved. It could be the case that if you had low network performance, if there was some other bottleneck, it could be the case that you'll have better network performance, but not because the network port is better, but just because there's fewer bottlenecks. So but then again, if networking is extremely important to you, that could be something to keep in mind. Now, there is an accessory that you won't need. You can still use it, but you don't have to have it anymore. Remember those? They're like a power or USB-C adapter that has a power cord or power button in the middle because the Raspberry Pi 4, didn't have a power button. So if you didn't have a case with a power button, you have a cable that has a power button on it that disables or cuts power to the Pi. You can still use that, but there's no reason to because there's a real power button this time on the board. That's kind of cool, actually. So
Cool add-on
they put
there.
a power button on there. I know it's like probably not the first thing I would have expected them to do, especially considering they didn't have to because the cases usually check that box. So it's kind of like something they didn't have to do, but they chose to do. But it's welcome. So definitely welcome. And according to Jeff Geerling, again, I've yet to do benchmarks. The micro SD slot is twice as fast. So if you were a bit IO constrained, that could help. And also, if the SD card was your bottleneck while transferring files over the network, that could be an example of noticing better network performance without having a better chip. Now, continuing along, and I know this is kind of like just a blast of specs here because we're just going to talk about our opinions on what this all means after I go through this spiel. There's the RP1 chip, which is built into the Pi 5. And what they did was they decided to put all the faster stuff on it. essentially the things that need speed. So first of all, and this is probably the thing that's going to raise more eyebrows than things that I've mentioned before. There's a 4-lane PCI 2.0 endpoint in this chip. So I'm not sure what all we could do with that yet because I have yet to try out those accessories. But just being able to say PCIe and Raspberry Pi 5 in the same sentence without it being like a case or some kind of attachment, that's pretty cool. The USB 3 controller is on this board, or excuse me, part of this chip, and each one of these controllers has a USB 3 and a USB 2 port on it. So kind of similar, but it's on its own chip now. And it also, and by the way, this is not used on the Raspberry Pi 5, but it's there, I guess, for future use maybe. It has support for eMMC on this chip, but there is not eMMC on the Pi 5. So I don't want anyone to think that there is, but it's basically for future use, but I'm not really sure what it's for. Maybe compute modules or something like that will utilize this. I'm not really sure, but it's part of the chip anyway. So it's there for whatever they decide to use it for. There's a 3-channel video DAC built in. And let's see, what else? Other notes. Well, I mean, there's a lot more about the RP1 chip, but this would be kind of dry if I just started reading, a page full of specs on this. I think that's pretty much the highlights there, especially the PCIe support with the PCIe 2.0 endpoint. It's going to be interesting to see what people do with that. I'll just say that.
And I think one of the interesting ones, and I've seen a few people talk about doing this because Frigate is popular for object recognition. If you have the Coral TPU, and now the PCIe will let you integrate that with a Coral TPU and a Raspberry Pi. I've seen a few people do videos on it. It's not something I've tested myself. I think Jeff Geerling tested the beta version of it when it was first released late last year. And that's an interesting use case, is being able to plug that in like that.
And now we get to talk about the accessories. And I think this is kind of something a lot of people want to pay special attention to because some things have changed and it's important to know about these things. So especially if you're planning on upgrading. Now, I already mentioned the adapter that's going to be needed if you have the older display camera cables lying around. I have a number of them myself, so I have to source this adapter myself. So aside from that, you will need a new power supply. I'm just putting that out there. Buy the one that they sell because the peak power consumption for the Pi 5 has increased to 12 watts. And I believe the previous one had a peak of 8 watts. And the thing is, if you use a previous generation USB-C power cord, it will work, but it's going to downclock it. Okay, I want to underscore this. If you use the original power cord or something you have lying around that doesn't have the right wattage, you're going to have a slower experience because it needs more power to run all these components. There's like a built-in power controller. I mean, they did a lot of work on this. So if you don't want it to run in legacy mode, I'll just say that. So buy the power supply. I'm sure there's going to be some on Amazon that'll fit the bill, but essentially they have it looks like a 12-watt power supply that you could buy. And it's funny because I noticed mine was running faster, but until I dived in, I didn't know about this. So even I was not getting my full performance out of mine since I've had it. So I plan on installing that new power supply today. In fact, I'm going to be showing them off in the video. I have all the accessories. I'm showing it on camera for the people that are listening in the car or whatever, hopefully safely. But yeah, dedicated power supply. For that. So you're definitely going to want to buy the power supply. Don't skimp on that. You'll regret it. So basically, according to my notes, the way this works, and this is reading directly from their notes from Raspberry Pi, if the Pi 5 firmware detects that the power supply is the older style, it's going to, or the newer one rather, if it detects that you have the appropriate wattage, it's going to increase the USB power current. So you're going to get that extra performance. And that's just going to be a lot better. So you don't want it in low power mode. Now, this was probably true with the Pi 4, but it's really true now. You need some sort of a cooler. Okay, you're just going to. I mean, with all this power, the clock speed is higher. It uses more energy, so you're going to need a cooler. You can't get away without it anymore. So Raspberry Pi sells a $5 active cooler that you could buy with if you were to go to order one. And of course, that's something I'll be showing off in the video because I ordered a few of those as well. So new case, there's a new case that fits the active cooler. So you don't need it. Well, I haven't tried older cases with it. It's not astronomically different, but considering the new cooling requirements, I would be surprised if all the older cases fit this one. So you'll definitely need some new accessories with the Pi 5. Now, uh, going further on the accessories here, there's some things that are not out yet that I'm looking forward to. Natively, the Power over Ethernet head is not available right now. There is a Power over Ethernet header on the board, but as last time I checked, which was last week, it wasn't out yet. But they're saying early 2024. It's currently early 2024, so I hope that means any time. But they're going to have an official Power over Ethernet hat available. And what's even more interesting, another accessory that doesn't exist today, is the M2 hat, which will give you access to NVMe storage on the Pi. That's an official accessory that's coming, also earmarked for early 2024. So I guess I read that to say pretty much any time now. So it'll be also interesting to see what people do with that. But I can't really comment on that because I have yet to get my hands on it, but I can't wait.
Yeah, I see people in the comments talking about the PoE hats. There's an alternative you can look at as well. You can find these cheaply on Amazon. They're little PoE to USB devices.
Hmm.
They will pass the networking through, so you can take a network cable and split them off. I've been a fan of these because the problem I've had, and I think even there's been several problems people have reported with the PoE hats on the Raspberry
Right.
Pi 4. Obviously, without the 5 ones being out, we don't know where they had trouble with wattage delivery. But when you're using an external one, you also solve the problem of finding one that fits the case you may have for your Raspberry Pi. It's also kind of novel if you have other random things you want to power over USB. That would work that way. So, being a PoE splitter, if PoE switches are actually relatively inexpensive now, and they seem to keep getting less and less expensive. So being able to power things off those little splitters, those are great. Just find those little inline adapters and on
Hmm.
Amazon. I don't think they're that much money. Maybe like 10. They cost as much as maybe an adapter for a wall adapter. But now you're driving it with PoE. I actually have a bigger PoE switch I'm installing, so I can do more of that because of the convenience of it.
Another thing I'll get back to that part in a moment because there's more to say about that. But there's actually the power management or power monitoring on the board itself. There's a command that you can actually read a bunch of information that I'm going to show in the video, which I actually, saw in Jeff's video. So I'll, of course, credit him for that. But that's pretty cool. And he also says there's a 7-second boot on his Raspberry Pi 5, which is pretty cool. That's a lot faster. And he also says, and I haven't tested this personally, 45 times faster cryptography. So that's pretty crazy. So, now you might be able to understand what I meant when I said at first it doesn't look like it's all that different, right? It's still quad core, it's still 4 or 8 gigabytes of memory, same number of ports for the most part. There's some variations here, but at first I'm like, okay, that's decent, I guess. But when you really look through everything that they're doing here, I mean, it's just kind of crazy to see how much they've added on. But
And I want to comment on those crypto accelerators. So
yeah.
I'm finishing up my review right now on a Netgate 4200. I've been using it for a while. And if you did a benchmark, like you looked at the CPU mark of my previous router versus this router, you're like, oh, wait, CPUs are only a few percentage. Like if you look at those CPU benchmarking ones. But when you look at the VPN performance I'm getting from one to the other, it's night and day because those crypto accelerators, having specialization on these chips goes a long way, and the kernels are getting more and more advanced at taking advantage of it. So these can be extremely game changing in terms of their ability to get the task at hand done, especially that crypto acceleration, man. If you're working on something on a VPN that uses that, suddenly now you're going to have better VPN performance that's going to really step it up.
Yep, and there's already some comments asking, does this compete with the Zima board? Another comment, rightfully so, brings up the fact that that's x86. But I think that's a good question to kind of at least take a look at, because even if you're not comparing it to that, someone's comparing it to something else.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the Raspberry Pi is that it's not really competitive, and I don't mean that in a way that it sucks. I mean that in the way that they're not overly trying to defeat anything else in the market. They kind of move slower. It's almost like, you have the Rock chips and all these others. That Raspberry Pi is almost like the enterprise equivalent. Now, I don't mean enterprise like you're going to run your entire company off of it, but the enterprise moves a bit slower, tried and true. The Raspberry Pi usually has like one model at a time that is more general purpose and might excel at some things and not others, but is more general across the board. And then you have some of these other products out there that are literally competing with the Raspberry Pi. I feel like Raspberry Pi isn't competing with them, but everyone's competing with the Raspberry Pi. So they're more setting a standard for the long term. I mean, we could have the Raspberry Pi 5 for several years. And of course, other companies are going to make things that will perform faster, might have some features that it doesn't have. The Raspberry Pi is more about, they have their own baseline and they have their community and they serve that community. But if you need something with more horsepower, you might take a look at something else. And even Jeff Geerling said this. I think he said there was some ways, and check his video to be sure, but I'm pretty sure he mentioned there's some ways in which the Rock chip is going to outperform this even still with
Yeah.
this new version. So,
And when it comes to Homelab wanting to squeeze out the most performance, absolutely, you're going to be able to find some other devices that may be able to
mhm.
outperform it. From a business standpoint, and we have a customer, I think they have 300 Raspberry Pis. I
Wow.
don't, when we've done some projects with these clients, or specialized tooling that needs to be dynamic enough to have these. So this client has a lot of Raspberry Pis that are all running Linux to do special applications, and they like them because it just works really well.
Yep.
And that, back to what I said earlier, that consistency. I know the product. I have a predictable outcome for it. I can get a lot of the same product. I can't remember if they're threes or fours the client has there, and it's not even on a roadmap to buy the fives. They're like, we don't need them. This
Mhm.
covers what we need to do. It's predictable. We have spares. And if one goes bad, we can just, grab the SD card or reflash it. Or I think they actually have an automation script that'll we can reload on it. I don't manage that side. We have a couple techs that do. And it's just a neat idea to be able to do these. It runs some screens for them and displays a lot of data. So it's really, I do see them kind of like you said, in that enterprise market space because of
Yep.
that standardization and mass production, versus the problem with some of the other ones is if there's something newer, they quit one production line and swap it out to another one very quickly. You can still find Raspberry Pi 4s available, and they will be available for a while before the Raspberry Pi 5 takes over.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because just like the enterprise, if a company is building products around the Raspberry Pi, they're probably not going to upgrade to the Pi 5 for now unless there's like a huge reason, because obviously when a company has a product and it works, it checks all the boxes, it performs the way that they need it to, there's really no need to go to the next version. They might potentially phase that one out over time, but just like you said, they still make the older versions. So if a company is standardizing on a previous Pi, they can continue to do so. And it wouldn't even be that abnormal for a company to just standardize on whatever the previous model of the Pi was, just for that extra battle tested use in the community. So that could be something that we'll see more and more of. But I want to go back to the whole Wake on LAN thing,
Ah,
power over Ethernet thing. I think I just gave away something I was about to say on. Whoops, spoiler. So there is not currently, but according to Jeff, there should be a way to do Wake on LAN. Now, today you cannot, but according to him, the firmware is the only thing stopping you. So the board can do it, but the firmware won't. So assuming that there's a firmware update in the future, you'll be able to do Wake on LAN, which is it might not sound like a big deal. Just plug it in, especially if it's power over Ethernet. But it'd be really, I mean, think of a Kubernetes cluster where you could actually have like 10 nodes, only have 5 active, and then as the load increases, Wake on LAN additional Raspberry Pis. Already you're saving a lot of power by running a cluster on Raspberry Pi, which is one of the reasons why you might want to do that. But you're saving power by only having the ones online that you actually plan on using. So you can potentially, if they allow this, have some kind of scaling feature, which would be pretty cool. and that might be something that would be a lot of fun to dive into, assuming we get that firmware update. But Wake on LAN, I think there was someone in the comments that might not have understood the purpose, but it's not for everyone. I meant to say power over Ethernet. Here I am getting the
Oh,
two confused. I'm sorry. Power over Ethernet. So um, I really, really like it. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that you have to have a use case for, but I really don't like a lot of cables all over the place. If you only have one Pi, you could argue there's really not much of a use case for that because so what? You have two cables attached to it. One if you're using Wi-Fi, that's not really that big of a deal. But having power over Ethernet just means that you don't have to have an ocean of cables if you have more than one of these, which is novel. You are paying extra for that privilege though, so it has to be the cable management has to be worth it for you. But if you have a home lab that's consisting of Raspberry Pis, especially if you want to save on your power bill, there's additional options that this can unlock for automation. And I mean, just imagine Home Assistant, for example, being able to press a button and then a Raspberry Pi comes online. I mean, things like that would be possible with something like this. So there's more use cases that you could throw at the Raspberry Pi 5. But then again, there's nothing that's going to be so amazing that everything else just ceases to exist. You still want to check the competition in air quotes, obviously, and see what's being offered here. But I was very surprised when I started looking deeper into the Raspberry Pi 5 that my initial opinion based on the news was totally inaccurate. And I'm really excited about this platform.
yeah, I'll come back to the Zima board. One of the things about the Zima board that I think is neat is the fact that it is x86 and it has a PCIe slot. So how does it
Mhm.
compare? It's not exactly a comparison because they're two different platforms. But myself,
Right.
one thing I really like, and I did a demo with the Zima board on my channel where I show it running TrueNAS. And that's something you're not going to be able to do on a Pi, not
Right.
TrueNAS because they don't have an ARM compilation. Being that it's x86, though, there's Zima board. My friends over at Two Guys Tech did run perfectly fine PF Sense on there, and having that PCA slot allows you to slot in another network card and kind of expand out from there to build yourself actually a reasonable router. Or what
Yep.
I think it's really fun for is kind of like they say, the hackable system. It becomes this kind of breadboard to experiment with things. When I do my getting started with PF Sense video, I might even do it on a Zima board just for fun because it's kind of nice to show that you can plug the cards in like that. I think that's a really cool feature. That's the one downside is once you go into the ARM, whether it's the Rock chips or the Raspberry Pis or all the variations, once you're in that ecosystem, it's not that you limit yourself too much, but you will run into things that just don't work on ARM because there's not compilations for ARM. They have not been ported. So there's still some advantage to this long tail of popular software, TrueNAS and PF Sense being a couple of them, OpenSense for those of you that want to use that. Those are all going to be x86 hardware, not ARM hardware.
Do you think the fact that TrueNAS Scale is based on Linux makes it more or possibly already capable of running on a Pi? Because I think that's a BSD problem, wasn't it? Or am I wrong?
No, the challenge is going to be this. This is where things get tricky, and this is when you want to build your NAS and you start looking for adapter cards. You go, wait, who's writing the drivers for all these cards to
Right.
get them to work? So you have that as a challenge. As far as I know, you can do ZFS on ARM. I don't really know how well it works. I don't know how much optimization goes into ZFS on ARM. I'm assuming it works. I've not really tested it, but right away
Mhm.
you go, you start running into a challenge of, oh, wait, I don't have a driver for my card that controls all the drives for it. So the controller card drivers can immediately become, maybe an issue, maybe not as well supported.
Yep, yep, that makes a lot of sense. So, one I wanna throw out a mention for Open Media Vault because, we're talking about
Yeah, that
TrueNAS
does
here.
have an option for that.
Yeah. We're talking about TrueNAS. So while you might not be able to do that, I'm sure somebody, out there is like, hold my coffee, I'll show you. I'm gonna do that. And if you do, let us know. But I think that with Open Media Vault, you could still have a NAS, and it's a pretty good solution as well. So by no means are we saying you can't have a NAS on a Raspberry Pi 5. You could use Open Media Vault. You could just install Raspbian or Raspberry Pi OS as it's called now, and hand roll your own by customizing all the config files. You can go crazy. So you could absolutely have an NAS, but there's just like Tom said, some applications that are systems that won't run on this. One example of this is if you do run a Kubernetes cluster on ARM, you will need to get container images that work on ARM. If the
Yep.
container image only works with x86, it won't work here. But thankfully, linuxserver.io has all kinds of container images that work on ARM. So as long as you're pulling from them, you shouldn't really be impacted by that. But if you try to get your container images from other registries, you might run into a problem where they won't run on the Pi. However, another trick to this is you could have a Pi cluster and then have, like, on Proxmox or something, maybe 1 or 2 x86 nodes for those containers to run on. That's a potential workaround here, but so far, I haven't run into anything on, linuxserver.io that didn't work on ARM, so,
Yeah,
that's
there's a
kind of a
massive
moot
amount
point.
of things compiled for ARM now. And ARM's really it's kind of surprising for how little power they use and the speed that you get out of the applications to run on there. I would say that that's kind of what's driving it because sometimes you go, oh, for the equivalent wattage, and this is what's making some of those ARMs popular. Like we get quite a bit of performance per watt out of there. So the pricing may be the same, but your performance per watts may not line up exactly the same.
I would even go as far as to say, consider linuxserver.io first, and then if they don't have it, then go to another registry because I don't know about you, I just don't feel confident about a registry with, like, I don't know how many. I'm just gonna make a random number guess, let's say millions of container images. I mean, who has time to go through all those and vet those? But linuxserver.io, this is literally what they do. Like, that's their entire thing. They curate all of these images, and I would trust that before I would trust any other registry. So I can't speak highly of linuxserver.io enough. It's my number one resource, and lately I don't think I've had to go outside of their registry in like over a year. So that's
Yeah,
a pretty good sign. So
they do a
definitely
solid
want to.
job on there.
Oh, they really do. So I know that was like a blast of information, but the Raspberry Pi being such a important thing to the podcast because we talk about it a lot, and some people run their home labs on this. It's kind of worth knowing: is this something that someone might want to upgrade to, or stay with what they have? Maybe something that I mentioned will be the thing that someone needed to really take their home lab to the next level, or maybe it doesn't really impact another person and they're happy with what they have. But I really think that it's just amazing to see this platform evolve, and I can't wait to see what they're going to do next. But for right now, we have the Raspberry Pi 5, and I can't wait to see how emulators run on this.
Yeah.
That's just a guilty pleasure. Like, if like I'm just hoping it could handle Dreamcast. If it can, then I'm just going to be like on cloud nine. But I'm not going to say that it can yet. That's a heavy ask, but you never know. Maybe it can. But
Yep.
that's a whole nother podcast potentially talking about
Yeah, I
gaming.
seen someone ask, we were talking about linuxserver.io.
Yep. linuxserver.io is the mecca for container images. Definitely highly recommended.
Is it
So,
is his handle Ironic Badger? I'm trying to
yep.
remember the
Alex, yep, yep, great
Alex.
guy. Yeah, he's awesome. He
Yeah.
Yep, he's a great guy. He invited me over to the Red Hat building for lunch just before Red Hat turned evil, which was kind of cool to go in there and see that for the first time. But yeah, he's a very very awesome resource for these kinds of things. So
Well, he's
definitely
part of
check
Linux
out his
IO.
podcast.
He's one of the
Yep,
founders.
yep, and his self-hosted podcast is pretty good too. So
Yep.
it's in the same wheelhouse as what we talk about. So honestly, probably watch both. So
Oh,
or
absolutely.
listen to both. So already, I can't wait to hear what people are doing with Raspberry Pis. I feel like we don't get enough feedback on this. Like sometimes it's you could ask a question, and I want to do a Q&A episode. It'd be really cool. So please ask your questions. I'd really appreciate that. But in addition to that, even if you don't have a question, if you're doing something really cool with your Raspberry Pi, I would really like to just talk about some of these creations.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Send us feedback at
yeah.
the show if you have a cool Raspberry Pi project. Um,
Yep.
there's there's one I've covered before. I have a short on it really, but I have a Raspberry Pi Zero that actually runs my e-ink display for my YouTube stuff. I've talked about it before on my channel. It sits behind me in my videos. Someone thought it was an actual like a plaque I made. Like, how does that get updated? I'm like, oh, it's a Raspberry Pi Zero glued to the back of a picture frame with an e-ink in the picture frame, e-ink display. So
That's been on my list of things to make for, like, 2 years now, and I haven't gotten around to it. I do have an extra Pi Zero, so maybe now's the time to actually do it.
yeah, E-ink displays is probably my favorite use of the GPIO stuff on the Raspberry Pis.
Mhm.
They're just kind of novel. It's
Yep.
That reminds me of one of the things I do want to order. I have an extra Pi Zero, and I want to build a badge out of it. There's a couple different badge options, so when I go to a conference, I can be nerdier than I usually am by having a e-ink badge that changes.
Some of the applications of Raspberry Pi are just so amazing. Sometimes like an idea could be so simple but so effective. I think it was around the time the Raspberry Pi first came out. So I think we're talking about the one or something. I mean, maybe the two. I don't remember. But it was before I went on my own. So I was working for a company, and they were going to throw out this, pretty nice HP LaserJet printer. They were throwing it out or putting it in recycling because it didn't support any modern version of Windows. Like HP just wanted nothing to do with writing a driver for it. But they did write a driver for Linux, though. Which is interesting, right? Because Linux had a driver, Windows didn't. So I took the printer, which is useless to anyone at that company since they all ran Windows. I plugged it into a Raspberry Pi, installed the HP driver, and made a wireless print server. So this old LaserJet printer is now a wireless printer in my network, and that's what I used for a long time. And considering I don't know, print maybe 10 or 15 pages a week, and I think the toner had a yield of 2,000 pages. I had a feeling that I would run out of printer before I ran out of toner, and that's exactly what happened. I just used it right into the ground and never had to buy a single toner cartridge for it. So, and that was thanks to the Raspberry Pi, and that was probably the very first thing I ever did with the Raspberry Pi, where it became something within the wheelhouse of my productivity. So, and that's a simple use case, and lots of people have done this. It's not unique to me. I mean, probably thousands of people have done this, but something as simple as that, or making a pet cam could be fun. Having a desktop, I mean, I think a Raspberry Pi 5 would be a way better experience for desktop computing than the previous version with the extra performance. So there's definitely a lot to use it for, but if you use it for something really cool, you got to let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Send it to feedback at the homelab.show.
Yep.
All right. That was the Raspberry Pi 5. Thank
Hmm.
you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.